In May 2009, a planned burn in the Narawntapu National Park got out of control, threatening a property and burning an additional 300 hectares of land. A fire crew worked against the clock to backburn a strip in front of the house to save it from the headfire. They were nearly trapped. Why did the fire get out of control? What were the sequence of events that led to the decisions that were made to defend the house? Could any other decisions have been made? Two edge strips were burnt 2 weeks before the main burn, with tracks acting as boundary lines. Edge burning was hampered by wet conditions. The main burn was planned for a southwest to northwesterly wind direction, with a wet creek forming the western boundary. Aerial ignition was to be used to strengthen the creek boundary by burning the eastern side of the creek before any further ignition was undertaken. The helicopter was then to fly subsequent lines into the burn area, dropping incendiaries at a rate depending on the fire activity. There were 3 small appliances planned for the day. One crew was on the other side of the creek down from the house, and the other crews were to start on the hill and then patrol the boundaries. Water was available from the creek. 8 people with a mixture of experience were assigned to the burn. The vegetation is dry sclerophyll forest with coastal heath on the boundaries. The burn boss arrived after travelling from the east coast of Tasmania, a drive of 4 hours. One crew of local staff and the remaining crews had travelled 4 hours from the west coast. All those who travelled had already been engaged in a heavy load of planned burning that week. Because of the benign conditions, the burn boss allowed one crew of 2 to go home. The burn boss briefed the crews and the helicopter pilot and navigator. The crews were at their locations before lighting commenced. Ignition commenced at 13:15 when the pilot flew the line of the creek to release the initial incendiaries. At 13:30, the fire was reported on the wrong side of the creek by the crew stationed below the house. Fire activity was reported to be 2 to 3 metre flame heights. The burn boss assumed that the fire had breached the creek boundary at some points. He and his crews left their position and travelled to the house to deal with the situation. A head fire of 2 to 3 metre activity was heading up toward the house. Scrub was between 1/2 to 1 metre high with about 10 tonnes per hectare. The burn boss contacted the regional office to let them know it was out of control. The burn boss determined the options he had: the crew's safety, the safety zones, and the escape routes. The burn boss decided to protect the house, and at 13:50 they commenced backburning around the fence line and the shed. He had a total of 8 crew, including himself, 2 with less than 2 years' experience and 4 with less than 4 years. The burn boss had to lead by example with the drip torches. Meanwhile, he was trying to field phone calls from elsewhere. Some of his crew were uncomfortable being in front of the flames. He did the best he could to reassure them. The backburning worked well initially along the shed and the rear of the house, but along the northern edge the lack of resources became apparent. At 14:05 the burn boss called for assistance from the Tasmanian Fire Service. By this time 1 of the 3 vehicles had run out of water, and the only refilling point was a garden hose. There were no water tanks at the house. The Rubicon Brigade arrived at 14:20 with a 1,200 litre tank of water, which was critical. The burn boss requested another unit from the Tasmanian Fire Service. The house was saved. Crews patrolled until all fire activity around the house had ceased. The burn boss then decided to use the Baker Beach Road to pull up the fire. They put in a backburn edge along the road. They were able to finally leave the fire at 2200 hours. The fire investigation later revealed that the fire did not burn across the creek. In fact, multiple incendiaries had landed on the wrong side of the creek, creating a significant line of fire. It is unknown whether the helicopter made a navigation error, or the wind blew the incendiaries on the wrong side, or there was a problem with the incendiary machine. The house was surrounded by significant vegetation, had no water tanks, leaf litter was on the roof and the gutters, and there were no significant cleared areas. The house would not be considered defendable, and in summer conditions crews would never have been there. If you were the burn boss, what further information would you need to make decisions? How might you improve your situational awareness? What assumptions do you think were being made at key stages? What questions to yourself would you be asking to challenge your thinking and assumptions if you were in such a situation? What might be operational or management areas that you would target for improvement?
I think the biggest mistake I made was it was just going to be a simple plain burn on a day. Didn't need a lot of resources, and we didn't really actually plan for anything that went wrong or was going to go wrong. So that was my biggest assumption, was it's going to be an easy day. At the end of the day it wasn't. Once the plain burn got out of control and went into a wildfire, it was a different situation completely. Probably the main thing is just don't assume that it's just going to be a simple operation. Look outside the square, look outside the burn block, and have a look at what's there, what would be in danger if something does happen. You need to look at that and have backup resources available, and make sure they are available as well if you do need them in a hurry, and have all that documented. Because just because I done the burn plan, not necessarily say that someone else would know exactly what I was thinking. So you've got to include a lot more into the burn plan.
We know things don't always go according to plan, and so we should actually make our plans accordingly. When we're in situations that look simple, or where we feel comfortable because they're familiar to us, or we feel safe, it's really easy to oversimplify, and it's really easy to make the mistake of not planning for catastrophic failure. And high reliability organisations will plan for catastrophic failure, not because they're risk adverse, but because they are aware of the consequences of failure, and they've got the appropriate steps in place to manage that and to manage the unexpected. And that's something that I'd like people to take away from what happened here. It really was a simple day. It was a really finishing off a job that had been going on for a couple of weeks. And it was a really simple thing that went wrong. And yet the consequences could have been really quite catastrophic. And we allow ourselves to be complacent at times. And we were really lucky that in this situation there wasn't a bad outcome, and that we've all had the opportunity to learn something from it in a reflective and a safe way. The defence of the house, or the shack, that really worked because of Phil's leadership, because of his 30 years plus experience in vegetation fire management, and really it worked because the crew that were with him were prepared to trust Phil and follow his leadership. But that defence of that house too was a really near thing. If those additional resources hadn't arrived just in the nick of time, the result could have been much worse. And I don't just mean the loss of the property, I mean people being burnt or even killed. And I think in hindsight, on reflection, we'd probably say that they shouldn't have been there. We can say that with hindsight. Why was Phil there? Well, because at the time that was the next thing to do. The fire had crossed the line and it was taking up the hill and there was a house in the way and he was on that train. That was the next thing to do. If we'd planned for catastrophic failure and followed the hallmarks of a high reliability organisation, those resources would have been in place. The vegetation would have been cleared back from the house. And so when the fire crossed the weakest point or the weakest part of the whole burn, it wouldn't have mattered because we would have already known what we were going to be doing and we would have already had the resources in place and we would have already prepared the ground just in case.